it's a Bart lecture, and we've talked about the Bart Fund. The Bart Fund was established within the faculty by the family who donated money in order to promote lectureships and debate within the faculty. And at Terry Bennett's suggestion, I approached the faculty a year and a half ago and said, would they be interested in sponsoring some of the medico-chirurgical and Pickering Association lectures? And they thought this was a good use of the money. It fitted in with the requirements of the lecture donation. And so that's why we're having a debate today funded by the Bart Fund. However, for many of us who were trained in Nottingham in the early days of its medical school, we had a unique experience because it was the first medical school to be opened in the century in the United Kingdom. And there were a lot of very enthusiastic educationalists who decided that if it was the first one to be opened in a long time, that they were going to try and make their mark. And one of them was this man, Maurice Backett. And you know, students are fairly skeptical about social in medicine, about social issues. Thought the main thing about doctors was about anatomy and physiology and biochemistry. And but Maurice managed to convey an understanding of the importance of considering practice in the context of the community with remarkable clarity, with absolutely unending enthusiasm, and really put our medical school on the map in this area. And I'm going to read a little section out of his obituary from the Times at the end of last year after he died. And it says, it's the first new British medical school to be established in the 20th century. At Nottingham in 1970 was formed from scratch. It was not surprising that its foundation staff planned to innovate. They envisaged such novelties as a research year between the medical scientific course and clinical years, but involvement with patients and clinicians from day one. The early courses to be taught interdepartmentally using multidisciplinary laboratories and the theme of the cell, man. But it was the far-sighted foundation professor of community health, Maurice Backett, who ensured that a third theme was to parallel these from the start, the community. Backett had previously held the first chair in public health and social medicine in Aberdeen from 58 to 69, where his teaching had been largely in the final years, ranging from the bedside to the wider community. He had stimulated students with his enthusiastic innovation, such as project teaching, in which they researched a topic and then created and evaluated teaching material, producing a book, a short film, and teaching displays. His reputation ensured his appointment to an innovative Nottingham, where the staff and students were to benefit from his dynamism from the very beginning of his medical course, firing the initial intake alone to apply his research methods from the Midlands to Morocco. And for some of us who knew the first few years, the reference to Morocco was relevant, because there was a group who went to Morocco for reasons best known to themselves, but they seemed to have a fantastic time. I don't know, Debbie, were you one of those people? You weren't, but there was a lot of stories about it. And I think, Alan and Sheila, you had plans and distant travelling. So Maurice Backett was somebody who fired a lot of this with enthusiasm, and I thought it was nice to read that out tonight, because one of the person I've asked to lead today's debate is a very close, long-standing friend of mine from those days, Bill Holmes. Bill and I started medical school together in 1972 in October, and I think the first year and a half we sparred with each other verbally on almost any topic. I think the moment that I remember once was in the Buttery Bar, end of the first year. We'd had a very heated debate on something highly political, and Bill said to me, when the revolution comes, Dave, it'll be the silver bullet for you. And so I introduced Bill Holmes, who's going to propose and second and probably argue with you on a whole raft of subjects to do with how you deliver healthcare in the community, part two with Maurice Backett standing behind him. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you very much. Well, David, I'm not sure whether that was a kind introduction or not, but thank you very much for it anyway. And I know it's traditional for speakers always to say thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here and all the rest of it. But for me, it's a particular pleasure to be here this evening, and not least to meet so many people that I haven't seen for ages, many of whom have come up to me and said, oh, you know, where have you been, and not quite sure what's happened to me over the years. One of the, I hope I don't get too melancholy and mournful this evening, looking back, nostalgic maybe, but I certainly do have very fond memories of all the days that we talked about there. And one of the occasions that I remember back in the very early days, which you may, I'm sure Mark will remember too, is going to a lecture given by Sir Hans Krebs, which was such a big deal that there was no lecture theatre anywhere in the medical school which could accommodate the number of people that he went to, and so we had to all troop off down to what I think was called L4 over in the engineering building to see Professor Sir Hans Krebs introduced by David Greenfield, the fantastic David Greenfield, who was the dean at the time. And of course, when Hans Krebs came in, and there was an almighty round of applause and all the rest of it, and a very modest chap was encouraging people to be quiet. He said, "I'm used to speaking to large audiences like this." He said, not because they're particularly interested in what I've got to say. He said, but because they all thought I'd died years ago. And I think there's perhaps a little element of that here. The first time that I met Maurice Backett, actually he interviewed me in 1971 along with Tony Mitchell, and the next time I met him was actually in November 1972, in our first year, in the rain at the junction of the M1 and the A52 when I was hitchhiking back to university, having been home in Liverpool for the weekend. And he stopped his car, which was an old Porsche, and I climbed into this sodden wet, having hitchhiked from Liverpool. And I recognised who he was when I got in the car, and he said to me, and I said to him, "Oh, it's Professor Backett." And he said, "Yes, you're Bill Holmes, aren't you? You're from Liverpool." And I was completely amazed that he should have remembered. Perhaps I shouldn't have been so, because there were quite a few people who knew me in those days for reasons that weren't entirely appropriate. But certainly he was the sort of person, as well as being eminent in his field, as I'm sure you will remember, was able to knew the names of all the students in those days and knew a lot about him. And I as I'm sure many do, think very fondly about Maurice Backett. Now, this is actually the second occasion that I've spoken to the Nottingham Medico-Chirurgical Society. You didn't mention that in your introduction. I actually spoke in 1977 when I came back from the West Indies, where I went and worked in a mission hospital there for 6 weeks, and I was given a grant of £300 by the Society in order to pay for my airfare, and I came to earn my supper by doing a little presentation to an audience of about 3 prior to one of the lectures. And this is another occasion for me to say thank you, not only on my behalf, but on lots of other people's who I'm sure have benefited from the Society's generosity over the years. So, David, as he said, he and I have known each other for a very long time, and he approached me 18 months ago now to ask me if I would lead a discussion about the area that I've been involved in for the last 10 years or so, which is working outside the NHS, doing a variety of activities, which I'll share with you in a minute, and had the experience of dealing with the NHS. And of course, when he asked me if I would do this, the first thing I said was not on your life, because I could imagine nothing worse than standing in front of a group of people working in the NHS who would see us as coming from the dark side. But he persuaded me to do so, and I said I wasn't prepared to give a lecture, still less lead a debate, but what I was happy to do was to lead a discussion, provided I could bring some friends with me to share the occasion, and that's what I'm proposing to do this evening. And I'm very grateful that the people that have come this evening to share this with me, who I'll introduce to you shortly. So this is David and I, and this was when he was best man at my wedding. I don't think Sheila has seen this photograph for many years. She probably doesn't reckon I'm the guy on the right as you look at him. and how sad it is for Jill and Sheila to see what we have become. We've turned from those young men into Captain Birdseye and Meatloaf. But David and I met, as he said, on the 4th of October 1972, when we came the first day of medical school. We met on the first day. I'd never met anybody who'd been privately educated, and it was quite a shock to meet somebody who was a public school boy. And here he is on that day, and there on the right, as you look at it, is Karpinski. There's a young Mark Karpinski that you'll recognize, who's looking at the top hat there, getting himself measured up for that, and making his career choices, I can imagine, in those days. But as David said, we enjoyed a lot of debating in those days in the medical school. So this is what Charles Darwin said when he went along to give a lecture, expecting people to shout at him over the proposal that he was saying that we were descended from apes and so on. And if you think I've come here to talk about the private sector and how it's wonderful and how it offers the opportunity to solve the problems of the NHS, then absolutely have not. I certainly don't believe that. And what I've come to do is to provide an opportunity, which perhaps you don't have too often, to hear from people who work with the NHS from the other side, who've had experience of contracting with the NHS, negotiating with the NHS, trying to deal with the Department of Health, and that's what we want to do this evening. One of the things which I might say is that I think that the private sector, the world of business, can do very well by having more doctors working in it, because the skills which one learns in medical school, I think, are hugely applicable to what happens in business, which is really about trying to work out what's going wrong and how to put it right. And this was a study which was, some of you will be familiar with, which John Hampton and Tony Mitchell did in 1975 when we first became clinical students, and in which they demonstrated that it's all about taking a history and formulating a plan of management. That's the key skill. And I think we've lost that, I think, a bit. But that's the skill which I most value in the people that work for me, the ability to look at something and work out what it is that's the problem. And I think our training in medicine lends itself very well to that. Now, I also have to be very modest, as I'm not standing in front of you here as someone who's made a great success as a businessman, because that certainly wouldn't be the case. So here is my take on what's happened in general practice since I left it in 2000, which is the earnings went progressively upwards as a result of QOF, and the workload went down as a result of being able to give up out-of-hours work. And I'd like you maybe to guess at which point I left general practice, which was exactly at that point. And I know of a certain consultant dermatologist who certainly questions the wisdom of me leaving general practice at just that point. I went to work as group medical director for a company called Nestor Healthcare as group medical director, and I was I had 7 years at Nestor Healthcare, which I was a lot of exciting times there, and I joined Nestor, who had grown hugely in the previous 10 years, driving the share price up from £6 to £6.50, and then in the 7 years after that, fallen back sharply. And David, would you like to guess at which point I joined the company? That's exactly where. Actually, it's not quite true. We had another 12 months before all the problems, but I certainly had a lot of experience over that time in trading statements, which is holding your backside out for the people in the city to kick it, buyouts, the resignation of the chief executive, a rights issue, votes of no confidence in the chairman. Some really exciting times there. But of course, the price to be paid was the contraction of the company, largely due to issues which were outside its control. And it was very sad to see that change during that time. But the experience drawn from all of that was enormous. And Mike Sadler and Justin Jewett, who are here with us this evening, who I'll introduce to you shortly, shared some of that ride with us during that time. So this is a summary of me over that time, and I went into general practice, firstly in Bingham and then in Sherwood for 20 years, from 1980 to 2000. And then along with Tom Venables, he and I established Health at Work, which is still going, and it's an occupational health consultancy which we built up. And I worked in respiratory medicine with John McFarlane for 10 years at the City Hospital, which was the most fantastic time for me, and the research that we did at that time. And then I was an elected member of the GMC for 5 years. And then that sort of divide there around that time is when I left the NHS and accepted the offer of going to work for Nestor as Group Medical Director. And Justin, who was the Chief Executive at the time, said to me, did I think I would be able to cope with the fact that my colleagues would turn their back on me? And I wasn't quite sure what he meant at the time, and of course I, with true modesty, thought that it wouldn't apply to me, but of course he proved absolutely right. And one of the key experiences that I've had over that time is that when you cross the Rubicon of going outside the NHS for reasons I'm not entirely sure of, your colleagues start to think of you differently. So what I do nowadays is I run a small startup company. I'm the chief executive. That's a rather big title for head cook and bottle washer. But the interesting thing for me is that this period here, when I was in general practice, is when I went from Bingham, having been in a partnership of 8, I went to become a single-handed GP in Sherwood. And I was single-handed for 5 years, and that was the most professionally rewarding time of my life, I think, and it was great to feel that you were in charge of what you did. And really that's what I do now as Chief Executive of EVG. I'm in charge of a small company. I decide what's happening, I set the strategy, I have guidance from others, and that's where the reward comes from, I think, in what I do, and perhaps you would agree that's what's missing in the lives of many people nowadays in the big organisation that the NHS has become. And I think if I have a single lesson, a single thing that I've learned over that time, is that managing doctors is very difficult indeed. It's much easier to manage patients than it is to look after doctors, and I guess we're going to hear some of that this evening. Now, along the way, I've met a number of people who, and some of them are here this evening, are going to help me. So, first of all, Doug Black. So Doug and I met, we'd known each other at medical school a bit, but he was in general practice with Norman, who's in the audience. I'm delighted to see him after so long. And when I was appointed to the single-handed practice in Sherwood that I took over, Doug, being the great friend of mine, appealed against the appointment and challenged it. And we all had to troop off down to London, if you remember, to the Medical Practices Committee, as it was, to have the appeal heard. Do you remember that? Hard to believe that in those days that jobs were so sought after that people would be fighting over them and that you would have to go down to London and do things like that. But that's what we did in 1988. Anyway, we remained friends as a result of that afterwards. And then a little later on, I met Nick Armitage for the first time, and as a consultant colleague. And up until that time, I had been the proud owner of the record of being the oldest person ever to play in the past versus present medical students annual rugby match, until Nick took that record off me and smashed it completely. He was playing. Are you still playing it? Not last year. These little legs come running out in his shorts, but he took that off me. And then Justin Jewett, who was the chief executive of Nestor, and then Mike Sadler, who was a Nottingham graduate, who was a few years behind me, who came to work with me at Nestor when we acquired the health call operation. And Mike and I spent 2 or 3 years of our lives and a large amount of our coronary arteries trying to sort out the quality issues in that out-of-hours business. And he and I used to go to bed, not together, I hasten to add, but we used to go to bed. used to go to bed being responsible at the time for the out-of-hours care of about 29 million people in England, ultimately responsible for that. And so those were big days there. So I'm not proposing this evening that we should have a debate, but rather a moderated discussion with some friends and also with some state-of-the-art audience participation, which are those cards that you have in front of you. And anticipating at least 300 people in the audience this evening, I thought that what we would do is I will pose some questions and we'll put the cards up. And as in, sorry, I haven't a clue, we need a Samantha. So I'm going to ask Caroline, if we do this, that she'll count the results, and we'll see where we are. So let me now turn to the friends. So Doug and Nick, you'll know very well. Don't need any introduction from me, except to say that I asked Doug particularly to be involved because of his experience as being the medical director of Nations Health, and now, of course, being the medical director of the PCT and being responsible for the performance management of 500 doctors, and I can tell you he's welcome to that particular job. Now, Mike Sadler is very, I hope you won't mind me embarrassing, a very competent guy. Trained in general practice and public health, and then I first met him when he was medical director at Prime Care. And he and I, as I was saying, we were working trying to improve standards in that. He then became the medical director and then subsequently the chief operating officer of NHS Direct. And he then moved on to be medical director and now is the chief operating officer of Serco Health, and that's a pretty big job. And then Justin, who wears many hats. I knew him initially as the chief executive of Nestor, but he's moved on and he's now visiting professor of healthcare at the University of Glamorgan. And interestingly, he is the senior non-executive director of a thing called NHS Shared Business Services, which is a business venture, 50% owned by the NHS, 50% by, Justin? Okay, who look after trying to find ways of making the back office functions of the NHS function better than they do. Many of you will know doctors.net. You probably have an account with them. He's a non-executive director of that and was previously the chief executive and the executive chairman of that group. And then he has his own healthcare business. And then last but not least, he keeps an eye on me as the chairman of the company that I run. So I'm going to ask those guys if they would come up and sit at the front, and we'll put the lights up, shall we, David? And oh, we'll save that till the end, right? So while they're taking their seat, let's try a bit of audience participation using my sophisticated system. So you should find in front of you that you have two cards, one of which has got blue and red, and the other one is
think she was a bigot.
The other one is white. Right. So then, here is a picture of Doug, allegedly earning his £500,000 a year. So let me just ask you this question then. So is that a fair portrayal of the situation of GPs in 2010? So we'll just, you hold up the red card or the blue card pointing to the front. Hold it up high so we can have a look. Caroline, you come down and you do the right.
So are you saying £500,000?
Yes, that GPs are earning £500,000 a year. Yes. Okay. So yes. Okay, Caroline, well, how would you say the split there is? Okay, well let's change the question slightly and say this. Let me ask you now that you've got your white card as well, if you want to use that. Let me ask you to hold the cards up high. So the same question about the £500,000. Is that fair? Yes, no, or there's some truth in it. Right, vote now. Okay. It's all confidential, Jazz. You don't need to worry. That's right. Okay, so, Caroline, how would you say it?
Well, I can't quite interpret because there's no yellow card, I don't think.
Oh, I'm so... right.
But anyway, most people, there seem to be an awful lot of white cards.
Yes, so people perhaps taking the view that maybe there is a bit of truth in that. So let's have another one here. This is a cartoon here. So, sorry, so yes will be red, blue will be no. Okay, and white, there being some truth in it. So let's have a...
People see the cartoon.
Yeah, okay. There we go. Okay, so red for yes, blue for no, and white. So a lot of...
Bart said even slightly more reds, but a lot
Not
of
many
whites.
blues anyway, that's for sure, is it? Right. So anybody recognise where that came from, that particular slide? So, yeah, well, it's the BMA's campaign in spring of this year. So we've clearly got a bit of work to do there to perhaps explore that. So what I thought we might cover this evening is a few questions, of which this is some. So, first of all, why would anybody want to work with the NHS? I mean, you do it on a daily basis, and you might not think it's such a great experience. So why would anybody want to do that? Secondly, what's it like working with the NHS rather than for the NHS? Then I think the NHS has quite a lot to teach the private sector, because as a workforce there's a great deal of loyalty, there is a fantastic brand, there is people, despite all the problems, people still do more than they are paid to do. They are interested in making sure that it's a success, etc., etc. There are many chief executives who would give their eye teeth to have people working for them who felt that way about the business that they run. And then perhaps how easy or difficult it is to achieve change in a complicated organisation. And there may be other questions that you want to put to us, then that's what we're here to do this evening. So what I thought I would do is I'd ask Doug to say a few words about what he thinks the issues might be, about his views from his experience of the dark side, and then I'm going to ask Mike to say something, and then we'll throw it open to you and we'll see where we get to then. Okay, so Doug, you're...
Okay, I'm just going to make one or two sort of brief little statements. And just really to illustrate my sort of in and out career with the NHS and a private company, I think, apart from my GP experience, became locally extremely well known as being a commissioner of health services, working with the NHS, and actually at one point entering being the clinical lead with Nottingham Health Authority for the entirety of Nottingham Health Authority's commissioning budget in the late 90s, to becoming a bit dispirited and a bit unhappy about the way things were going in the NHS in 2004, 2005, to then having commissioned and been involved in the work of setting up and designing the building of the treatment centre, then being asked by the company that successfully got that contract whether I could work for them on some service development issues as they began to get geared up before they started actually doing any service delivery out of that facility, because when they were awarded the contract, the ground had not been broken. And just like as Bill said, when I announced that actually was what I was going to do for a bit, the reaction of my colleagues was most interesting to observe. From, if you want to do that, you get on with it, and we'll happily carry on supporting. To and this is a direct quote: "You've gone to the side of Satan." which was, and that was actually from a professor within this building, who I won't name. So it was an interesting mixed reaction, and I continued to endeavour to set up nation's healthcare, really to work. I mean, the main part of the work was actually to work with the NHS, with the consultant teams here in this in this hospital, to agree what the service offer was going to be like out of the treatment centre, and actually get down to some of the detail about the patient pathways, etc., etc. So it was a lot of working from a private perspective with the NHS, and I found that quite an interesting experience, because it brought home to me how some of the internal processes in a large, complex organisation are diabolically slow, and really do prevent a quick way of doing things. So that's one point I would like to make. And I then, at one point, then was part of a takeover of the company. And that was a sense of complete loss of control as nations were taken over by Circle. And it became evident to me how quickly and actually how brutal those sort of things are. Never been exposed to it previously. When the takeover actually occurred, key individuals had disappeared either by the end of the first day or by the end of the first week. It was just, and today, for example, I and my executive colleagues at Nottinghamshire County PCT have been talking quite openly about how we are going to make 30% management cost reduction, and how redundancies are in there, and the prolonged process that it takes to do that. And yet, in the private sector, basically, it was lined up against the wall and cheerio. So that was quite an experience to actually see that. One other point I'd just like to make, and I actually made this when I was working for Nations to GP colleagues, because there was a definite sense of that cartoon that you've just seen, was to actually reflect back that the way general practice is organised is that basically general practices are small businesses, and they are essentially private things, in as much as they are run very similarly to any private company. The shareholders happen to be the partners, and the idea that working in general practice is orthodox NHS and therefore it's all cosy and nice is absolutely not the case when you look at general practice in the way that I've just described. So at that point, I'll
right.
cease.
So Mike, what? Again, I'm keen that we should sort of share with the audience the experience that we've had of being on the other side of the table and working with the NHS, and you've now done that even at higher levels than I did in my day. What's your experience of that?
Well, thanks, Bill. I suppose the first thing is actually it's nice to be back here, because I suspect that most of the people here are relatively local to the medical school, which I'm not. In fact, I think I've spent more time here this evening than I did in my whole first term, which probably explains an awful lot. The other thing, I'm intrigued by how interesting the presidential election appears to be here, where I don't remember this in my day. Actually, I'm thinking of making a late run for that, judging by the standard of some of the social reps and some of the year reps. So, but if you'll forgive me trying to get back to the subject, I suppose a few reflections from my point of view. I think the first thing is that I suppose, have gone into the private sector, back into the NHS, then back out to the private sector. And I think things have changed. I think it's unfortunate that we can all sit here and tell tales about how it was when you first moved in, but I will have my own one. I was a Deputy Director of Public Health in Portsmouth, and we'd worked very closely with a whole series of GPs, one of whom was on our advisory panel. And when it was announced that I was going to Prime Care as the medical director, I got just a one-line email from him. Quite a friendly guy. And in capital letters it said, "Traitor." And I mean it. And I thought that is truly remarkable, how any well-educated human being could actually begin to write that sort of thing. And I think that's unfortunate, and I think it demeans us as a profession. I think it demeaned him as an individual. But I have to say that is now less prevalent than it was. And I'm pleased about that, because I think my reflection is there's much more that unites us than divides us. And I have to say, in all the time that I've been in the private sector, I have never woken up in the morning thinking, I wonder what the share price is. It has generally been, how do you get the best quality service out of a limited resource envelope? And I think the resource envelope limitation may be imposed by public budgets, it may be imposed by shareholders, but the reality is that is a challenge that faces all of us. And I think the other reflection is that we have different skills. I was very proud of the NHS, very proud of the attitudes in it, of the people in it, very proud of enormous things that we achieved. And I still am. In fact, the company that I work with, which I'll talk about briefly, tends to work in partnership anyway. But I equally, when I go into the private sector, find there are a number of skills, a set of experiences that actually I didn't have before, and generally in the health service it's not that prevalent. And I think if we get to the stage where we stop seeing the two as being rivals, competitors, and we start to think ourselves as being collaborative, in other words, can you marry the best of the public service with the ethos, the skills, the dedication to the private sector, that's, I think, when we start to make progress. And there's no doubt in my mind that the skills in terms of financial management, in the ability to move workforce on, and that is hire and fire, in the ability to look from a different angle, to bring innovations from elsewhere in different sectors and parts of the world, is something that I've gained in Serco, which is my current company, that I didn't have before. And I suppose the other reflection is, and it's particularly true in Serco because it's the biggest companies that nobody's ever heard of, but it is a FTSE 100 company. It does everything from run the National Physical Laboratory to the Atomic Weapons Establishment to empty bins in Winchester to running a whole series of health companies. And what strikes me particularly about being there is how so many sectors have accepted outsourcing, privatization, partnership, call it what you like. The reality is that so many sectors now take for granted the bit that by actually sharing some of your skills, bringing other people in to do what they do better, you can fundamentally improve the type of service you're offering, its customer awareness, its ability to be efficient, its responsiveness, its ability to innovate, and sometimes to just get the investment into that service that you need to make major change. So I suppose my general observation is, I think we've slightly, to some extent, come through the really difficult resistance. I still think there are some ideologues out there, but I think it's becoming less so. Though having spent a morning with the BMA today, perhaps some of them are still there. But I think we now have to say, forget where we've come from. What we should be doing is trying to derive the best possible service for patients that we can. And actually that needs a really diverse range of skills, and it's very unlikely that any one sector of society or provision will have that. So how can we be really honest about what we do well, really honest about what others do well, and bring that to the benefit of the whole health service? So happy to pick up any of those points as we go forward, but I think that's my sort of overall observation.
Alan, what's your take on that? Do you think, let's give Alan Birchall, is that, you buy any of that, or is that all rubbish?
No, I don't think it is all rubbish. I just find it's very, very difficult to accept why people who have been working in the NHS and have proved that they've been totally committed to the NHS find a need to go out of it into the private sector. And I think the bit that I struggle with most is why would a private company want to work for the NHS? I don't think that issue has been addressed by any of our panellists at the moment. And
Justin, let's prepare Justin for that, and he can come back and
yeah, well, that's an area I'd like the panel to expand on. I mean, it seems to me that there is certainly the element of this is a cash cow. Let's get in there and strip out what we can for our own benefit. Now, I'm sure there'll be a lot of disagreement with that, but there is an element of it that I'm sure many people consider to be a problem.
Yeah.
And I'd be interested to know particularly what the panellists' views on that issue are.
Okay. Anybody else want to make any points before we come see if we can answer that particular question?
I think the question of a cash cow, I just cast your mind back to the 1970s and how people viewed government funding then when they worked for a government organisation, how people viewed society then in the workplace, whether it be a private organisation. Everybody thought big organisations were cash cows. They felt they could borrow the paper from this place, they could take the pens. And I think there's been a change in attitude where people are much more honest about how they deal with the sources of income. And I think the diversity of income and funding of different sectors of the health service has moved in parallel with an enhanced honesty and openness. So I don't feel quite as strongly as Anglan about it. That I think there's been a change in attitude which has been remarkable, actually.
Justin, why would anybody want to work with the NHS? What would be the answer to Alan's question there?
Well, I was just trying to think, because there are a variety of different answers to this. First and foremost, you're all referring to a generic term called the NHS. But I guess almost everyone here, bar me, is a medic. So you've got a particular aspect of the NHS. You say, that's the NHS. I'm the senior non-exec for NHS Shared Business Services. We do all the back office stuff. That means the payments, the check raising, payroll, purchase to pay, all of that good stuff, accounting, the whole thing. Doesn't it strike you as being crazy that there are, 300 trusts and local authorities involved in the NHS, and they have something like 250 different back office systems, when you all do the same thing? And that's why companies come into the NHS, because there are some crazy things like that companies come in and say, well, blimey, we've just done this for Barclays, they're on a single system. We've just done this for BT. Let's do the same for the NHS. And you're a great customer once we've actually convinced the finance directors that they really do want to lose their power base of all their people and that they really are going to go through the pain of cutting back on numbers. So now that's easy, isn't it? Because everyone can agree, no one likes accountants. So you're all quite happy with me saying that, aren't you? You can see the sense of that. Now let's go one step further. Right? Which bit of the NHS is most outsourced in terms of patient delivery? The answer to my rhetorical question is whichever bit isn't closest to the medical profession. Right? If you look at it, right, domiciliary care, the delivery of care into people's own homes by care workers is 81% outsourced into the private sector. It's grown out of nothing, 1993, and been fully developed. My own thought is that it's furthest away from the medical profession, the least interest, so therefore, no problem. It can be outsourced. Some of the long-term care and the more boring areas of delivery, outsourced. Almost 100% to the private sector. Very, very small, but almost totally outsourced. The minute you get anywhere near going up to something that may have more medical interest or more medical involvement, then we get the challenge of people running to the bank with cash. Now, that's a fair old challenge to all of you sitting there. What I would say is the private sector is infinitesimally small. It can't do more than 1% of what your defined NHS can actually do. It can't do it. So it can only act as a stimulant, a challenge. That ISTC out there is probably more of a challenge to the practice and procedures of NHS consultants than ever it was to actually deliver patient care, which is very important and very well done.
It's a fair point, though, that the NHS is seen as a cash cow. I mean, there's a lot of money to
absolutely.
there, and I mean, that's not...
But there's a lot of opportunity therein that just lies there saying we can do it smarter at times, but with the help of the NHS.
Nick, do you in your experience of over the road at the treatment centre. Do you find that there is impetus to do things better and smarter, or is it all driven by trying to make it more profitable?
I ought to say in the first instance I'm still an NHS employee of NUH, but there is still within all our systems, and it's something I've observed throughout the time here, an enormous amount of waste. Most of that waste does nobody any good, particularly the patients. And if you can remove that, if you like, then that is one way of doing it smarter, but doing it less expensively. And just very simply, why should a patient have an appointment changed 3 times? 3 times because consultants are away on holiday or suddenly cancelling stuff. It's not a sensible thing to do. And there are many instances of such changes in processes which can be done. It's quite a dichotomy for me at times, is because I am still employed here. I am not a circle person. I'm a clinical lead. It's trying to form a bridge between those two things. I don't specifically see that the ISTC is there simply as a method of creating cash. Clearly cash is necessary to make any business work. I have these far more better businessmen than I am here, and but that cash is clearly necessary. There's cash there to change processes.
Jazz, how do you feel about being described as a businessman? Do you think that's fair, as Doug was describing it there? Jazz Bilku, who was in practice for 30 years?
I think actually, as usual, the truth lies somewhere in the middle. I mean, I can still remember when I first came into practice, around about the time that you did, one of my senior partners never signed a night visit form because he said he came into general practice to deliver care and not to sign forms to collect the money. Money will come, that was sort of secondary to him, and he was not a businessman, he was basically a clinician. I think with fund holding and all the other sort of initiatives that have been over the years, things have shifted, and I think they've shifted in the right direction so that now a lot of people are aware of what things cost at least, and it's in their psyche when they're actually making decisions as to what what they're buying and where they're referring to. I think things are moving a little bit too far. Just as an example, one of my colleagues said the other day, I don't think I'm going to offer ECGs to my patients because the PCT who bought the ECG machine will now not service it because they won't pay for it to be serviced. Now, the fact that he's not earning a 500k, but he must be earning 150k at least, to actually say to his patients, because somebody else won't service the ECG, I'm going to refer you back to the PCT, or if you like, not do ECGs for you. I think that's disingenuous. And I think if we're not careful, I can see the altruism is dying and things are too much, if you like, linked to money. So I think whereas we've actually moved in the right direction, and quite rightly so, I think we have to go back to the values that, if you like, my senior partner had at the beginning of my career.
So Stanley Harris, ex-president of the Society, practiced as GP in Nottingham for 50 years? 40 years? About that. How would you, what's your take on have things improved?
You mean the NHS as a whole? Or
Yeah,
just
patient care, let's say, yeah.
Patient care is much more impersonal now.
Uh-huh.
It makes it much more difficult for patients to get the best out of the National Health Service. And I think an awful lot of work should be now attempted to remedy this. I don't know if you recall, there was a lecture in the Med-Chi about 2 or 3 years ago when 4 GPs who had retired from general practice because they really couldn't do it, and a manager appeared, and they were all working in some phase for the NHS. And I must say that we asked them questions, but I didn't understand a word of what they were talking about. And there are some things now, what with all the acronyms that occur, that I don't know what they're talking about at all. And I look at this and try to analyse it, but I don't think it's contributing towards patient care. I think the gross care in hospital, etc., is far improved. I would agree on that, but I don't think in general practice.
And how are you going to bring that back, Doug, in your role as...
I think there's really good evidence that general practice over the years has upped its game, and that there is now a definable way through the quality and outcome framework, which of course does contribute to practice income, whereby practices can demonstrate that over a range of conditions that they are delivering good quality care, which we know will result in good clinical outcomes. Locally, general practice, both in Nottingham City and in the county, is better resourced by the PCTs than many other parts of the country. So there's good investment, and I think generally speaking, a better service.
I think what Stanley is saying is that he accepts that lots of aspects of it are better.
Yeah.
I think what you were saying is that the patient experience hasn't improved along with it. Is that what you were saying?
Yes,
well,
I would agree.
Okay, well, I think as a GP of 22 years standing now, that that key dynamic, that individual doctor-patient relationship, I don't think that's deteriorated to any great degree at all. What has happened, I think, is that because there was so many other people who perhaps get involved in an individual's care, that it can appear fragmented and perhaps suffers from a quality aspect in that regard. But I think that central dynamic is still as valuable therapeutically actually as it ever has been.
Let's just have a show of hands then. How many people would share the view that the patient experience in 2010 in general practice is better than it was in 1980? Better. And how many people would say that it's not as good as it was in 1980? So, 2/3, huh? I've given up on that. Oh, sorry, yes, of course, and about the same. Spoken like a true scientist, Brian. Yes, quite right. Yes, Alan. Okay, pose a better one.
Well, because there's 2 aspects to it. Yes, the patient experience has improved tremendously in the last 20, 30 years. And it's improved for a number of reasons. One is that obviously there is a lot more money gone into the NHS. People get referred more appropriately, they get seen quicker, they get specialist treatment much quicker than they used to. Standards have gone up across the board. So if you're asking along those lines, yes, the patient experience has gone up tremendously. It's also gone up tremendously because of the introduction of things like training of GPs. And vocational training have probably had a bigger overall impact on the kind of care that most of our patients get, not just in the primary sector, but in the secondary sector as well. So there are those issues that have significantly changed their experience. If you then start to ask the patient, what about personal care, then their experience is not necessarily as good. And I accept what Doug says, that there are lots of other people who are now involved in the care. But the accessibility to a single GP within a practice has gone down tremendously, largely because we've got out of hours has affected that, but also there are so many GPs now are involved in doing other things, like management, like working in hospitals as clinical assistants, etc., etc. So I think if you ask whether the patient experience has improved over the last 30 years, it depends in what area you're looking at.
Is that something you can put right, Mike, in Serco? Is that...
Well, in the old tradition, I'd actually like to go back to Alan's previous point, because I think it comes on to something up there. Because Alan, you said, I think you said it's sad, or I can't understand why somebody would want to leave the NHS to go to the private sector. And that was a very interesting question. I thought underneath... Okay. Well, I think, and I'll try to, if I can, Bill, link the two. Firstly, I think the question itself is very interesting, because I'm not sure in any other walk of life we'd ask that. When my dad was a paint rep, if you move from Dulux to Berger, nobody said, why on earth would you do that? Generally speaking, people move for more challenging, more interesting, and more varied jobs. I think if you look at the difference that I would say that's very evident between the private sector and the health service, and it slightly explains what I'll come on to in terms of what it's like working with them, you actually have the ability to change things much more rapidly. You have the ability to call on a much more diverse set of skill and resource. You have the ability to call on investment. A whole range of things make doing the sort of job I'm doing now actually huge amounts more fun, huge amounts more influential, and huge amounts more challenging than comparable jobs in the NHS. And I say comparable, there aren't that many. Actually, the NHS does not make very good careers for people who are ambitious medical managers. Now, what's it like, therefore, working with the NHS from this side? Well, some of those traits become very apparent. Now, I'd have to say, and it's not a plea to get the audience on my side, it's just a fact, that by and large, working with the clinician side of the NHS is generally fine. Most docs fully understand issues around money, around quality, around efficiency, around the value of their own time. And so, to be honest, our real difficulties tend to be working with the managers. And having been one myself, this isn't, as I say, an attempt to just be cosy clinicians here. I just, about 6:05 tonight, got a note through. We run a big out-of-hours service in an unnamed part of Britain. And we're interviewing for the new manager for that out-of-hours service next week. And the PCT had offered to put a very senior bod onto the panel, which is great. I think it's really important that we share that and we have some share in the appointment. They've just sent me a note saying, actually, we've been advised by our procurement people that we shouldn't sit on that panel because this contract is due for renewal in 14 months' time. That is a classic illustration of the difficulty of working with the health service because, at their worst, they're unimaginative, inflexible, bureaucratic, don't understand the bigger picture, and try to stick to rules at the defense of their own roles, whereas actually we've all got to move much faster if we're going to keep up with society. So why would I want to go and do a job in the private sector? Because we're much more responsive and we don't come across that. What's it like working with the health service, the NHS? Sometimes extremely difficult, not for reasons of quality, but because judgments are made for other reasons. And I think that's why I said at the start, you've got to get the best of both worlds. The dedication, intelligence, and public service ethos of much of the health service with that get up and go, change stuff, commercial, innovation and investment attitude that comes with the private sector.
Justin, are managers in the NHS different than everywhere else, or is there something about managers in the NHS? I mean, that's a pretty gloomy picture that Mike's just painted there. Is that managers in other businesses such that you've been in?
Well, I think there are. Every company has got its own weaknesses and strengths when it comes to management. I mean, I've worked for the largest corporation in the world, Mobil Exxon, and you've got some fantastic people in there, right the way through, to a very small business. The big difference is when you're dealing with people like yourselves, when you're trying to manage a structure with people like yourselves, you're talking about managing the top 2% educated of the population. And the managers aren't used to actually not being as well educated, if not less well educated, than the people who are really doing the work. And so it's tremendously difficult, I think, for many people in the NHS. So they've ended up converting from administrators to the title of managers. And they just don't, I think they're hidebound, apart from some really good ones. Can I just throw one in on patient experience, though? Don't forget, we've now got something called the internet that's changed everything in the last 10 years. We've got intelligent, well-informed patients, or they think they are. Plus, you've got a subculture now of new medics coming in who are communicating all the while on the internet. 30,000 doctors a day are talking on Doctors.net UK, in the forums and everywhere. So you're into a whole different dimension now on patient care as well. And that means management challenge as well. People talking much more about what's happening. Speed of information moving much faster.
Sheila, you had your hand up? Yeah.
Yes.
Only if things have changed. You never did before.
Hi, I'm a well-known ideologue, and I've recently retired from NHS practice, but I spent over 20 years as a senior medical manager in one of the Cinderella services in old age psychiatry. And I have to tell you that I think that we did more innovation, more disinvestment, reinvestment changing, more fast thinking, quick on our feet stuff in there than you see in many a private sector place. And I have to say, I visited Nations Healthcare recently and noticed that at 4:30 it was almost impossible to find a member of staff around, so it's not extending itself. But one of the things that worries me about the NHS is that it hasn't got performance management right at all. And we are still struggling with managing poor performance in colleagues at all levels. And I actually think that unless the NHS really picks up and tackles that issue, then it's going to be a sitting target for private sector to get in there, because the private sector can kick people out just because they're not up to standard, which I would have liked to have done many a time in my career as a medical manager and was not able to.
Somebody else has their hand up at the back. Was that? Yeah.
Hi, good evening. I'm Jake Linus. I'm a GP. I work with Circle, and up to a few years ago I was in partnership. Now, the question that I want to, an angle I would like to see a bit explored is about this thing called NHS. Now, there is the NHS as an ideology, and I think when we have questions about why people live it, it's about living that ideology where we grew, where we got our values, so the way of caring, and so. But there is the NHS corporation, which I wonder if really there's a difference between the NHS as an entity and a private sector company. And I think that trying to have margins at 30% or having 30% efficiency savings doesn't really have that much difference. The NHS at the moment is trying to manage a budget and to actually raise money. And I have not seen, particularly in secondary care, which is bigger and so has more the appearance of an industry, much difference between the style of management and what I would expect to find in any company in trouble.
Okay, thank you. Somebody else had their hand up? Yes.
Can I just...
So, Adrian? And then Alan after that?
I think one of the things which hasn't been mentioned very much so far is the influence of the government in all this. Because over the last few years, it appears to me that we've had a government which has wished to change things very quickly. Often it's motivated by the date of the next election. The consequence is that they've tried to bring in the private sector to achieve fast results, and they haven't been terribly critical of the way in which the money's been used. What I've seen of it, like the private finance initiative, has meant that we've got relatively poor value for the money that's been invested and saddled the future generation with paying off the loan. And you could argue that that money could have been raised on the finance markets directly. And the other thing that I would say too is that the government also took a rather odd view towards pay structures in the NHS. And they paid both hospital doctors and GPs a huge increase through misunderstanding what working practices were. I benefited from that, but I think that government has, rather than the private sector, has been largely responsible for what has been poor value.
Yeah. Alan, yeah.
Oh, what can I say? The greatest innovators in the NHS are in the NHS. The most uplifting news item this morning was the fact that the catering department at Nottingham University Hospital has just agreed to resource its foods locally and saved £100 million. Instead of buying Argentinian beef, we can buy it from Derbyshire. That's innovation, you know, and we have some good chaps who can do it. What about another? Yeah, okay. But I think the word that hasn't been used, of course, which is what the private sector is accused of a lot, is cherry picking. Now, you know, and we have to recognize that is the big issue, because in fact medical care is becoming more complex as the demography changes. With more elderly people, we don't actually need medical care, we need joined up social and medical care, and that has to be done by people who are responsible all the way along the lines. Interestingly, I've just come back from the United States, where 25 years ago, the debate in the medical conference was not about the latest medical innovation, it was about managed care. And now I've just come back from the States, where it's all about bundled care. And you know that what they're talking about is actually putting the community bundle with the NHS, with the hospital bundle, so that people get continuity of care. And one last anecdote to finish was a local guy wrote in the BMJ recently. He said, well, there was this dear old lady, very confused, suddenly. She had private health insurance, couldn't get her into the private sector. She eventually got a bed in, and somebody found she had a sodium of 110, stopped her diuretics, and she was better in 24 hours. But she could not get a bed in the so-called cherry-picking private sector. And that's where innovation, sure. Let's bring in people. Let them move between the two. Let's the yellow tie of the coalition. Let's actually join up as much as we can to be efficient. But remember that largely the private sector doesn't want to know about chronic care.
David has told me we've got to finish at 7:30. Is that what you're going to?
Yeah, I was just going to say one thing. I think one of the things we haven't heard much about here is how you create clinical innovation in healthcare, and how you integrate research into practice, and how you drive forward new developments. And no one's really mentioned that in this discussion, but my life is full of that. I spent my life running trials, developing new treatments, integrating with day-to-day practice, and looking how to make new developments happen within this complex system of the healthcare. And actually, it's something that's very hard to do in the private sector, but it can be done. And commercial organizations use the health service as their development testbed by running commercial trials in the NHS. And so if we really want to, the OECD commented upon the fact that UK falls behind in cancer survival rates compared to the rest of Europe. And their observation was that we had failed to invest in technology, but we'd invested in huge numbers of people. And it's that sort of thinking, that observation, if that's true, then we in the health service have to use our research expertise, but also use our ability to bring in new technology. This hospital is a leading brain centre, but we don't have an intraoperative MR machine. In the private healthcare, that would be there as a starting point. And so getting big capital in to make things happen is very difficult. So it's a very confusing picture. We haven't talked about how you do these sorts of technical developments. Some of them might go better in private healthcare, but they would be for the large volume work. For the small volume, high complexity work, private healthcare, as far as I see, finds that harder to do. So it's a very confusing picture. And we're all talking about the NHS. It is many facets. I'm just trying to illustrate that point.
So if I could have just 30 seconds to finish, the purpose that you invited me to come to talk about this evening was sharing the experiences that we've had, and all the troubles that I've had in dealing with the NHS over the last 10 years. I've never ever had any problems with the individuals as clinicians. The problems become of the entrenchment that there is, which I'm quite sure is seen as a defense mechanism, defending something that is held to be very special and very valuable. But I do think that that entrenchment is actually holds back useful change. And if we could find a way of encouraging more people to move from Serco to NHS Direct to Prime Care to being a chief executive of a PCT, I actually do think that that would be fundamentally of benefit to the development of and the provision of better health care in the UK. And that's my point.
Dinner 18 months ago and said, I think you need to come and tell us what you've been doing for the last 10 years. And he put that graph up at the beginning of his thing where he left the health service and the income went up and the activity went down. And I always wondered how anybody can afford to run a business where you pay more people to do less. But Bill made a success of it. Even though he made a success of being part of a company that was diminishing in size, he made a success of it. He made a success of taking on another job. He's made a success of building his occupational therapy business. He made a success of our rugby team with some fairly dodgy people in it. So Bill is an extremely successful person, and he's able to command all these highly successful people to come and discuss with us their experience of working in different aspects of healthcare from different perspectives. And I'd like to ask you all to really give them a very warm round of applause. This has been a very interesting, interactive session, and I'll remember the colour cards, and I'll be using them in the future. Thank you very much.